Okay, I think we're ready.
Okay, are you ready to proceed, Mr. Rankin?
Yes, I am, Mr. Hearing Officer. Thank you.
We have a court reporter. Are we on? We have a court reporter. Are we on the record, Ms.
We're on the
Apodaca?
record.
Okay, were there any preliminary matters before we get right back into testimony? Do you have something, Ms. Hardy?
I just had an update on our witness order due to schedules. I advised Mr. Rankin. After Mr. Burkhead, we are still planning to call Mr. Buckwalter. But then tomorrow we would call next Bob Trentham, because he has limited availability.
Okay,
And then after that, we would call Steve Melzer. And then Joe McShane. Galen Dillowin. Jack Wheeler.
you're being pretty optimistic.
I know, hope springs eternal. Deacon Merrick, and then William West.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Rankin, pick it back up with Mr. Burkhead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Burkhead.
Afternoon.
We had left off and I was going to get into another section of your testimony where you had done some analysis on a particular well. And that's the 746. And I guess you don't have a map, do you, showing where all these wells are located in your testimony?
No, but Ryan Bailey does.
Ryan does. Okay. Maybe it would be helpful to have that just as everyone can kind of figure out where we are. As I'm just thinking about it right now. Do you happen to know which exhibit it is by any chance?
Within Ryan's testimony, no.
No. Okay. See if I can find it real quick. Sorry for making everybody real dizzy. Just don't look at the screen for a moment. Okay, this has got it. So, Mr. Burkhead, I think the next section or topic that I'd like to discuss with you is your specific interpretation of this one well, this EMSU 746. And here I've got up Mr. Bailey's exhibit K2, and it shows the outline of the EMSU unit and the wells that have been interpreted by Ops Geologic are the wells with the green stars, correct?
As far as I know, yes. I didn't make the map, but yes, that looks like that is what Ryan said yesterday.
Okay, and the well I'm talking about here that we're going to engage in is the EMSU 746, and it's this well. I can't tell whether it's in section 14 or 15, but it's sort of on the eastern side of the southeastern side or eastern side of the unit.
Yes.
Okay. Back to your exhibit L26. This is the interpretation or final solution that you have provided for this particular well, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there's one particular area that I'm most interested in here, but just to orient the commissioners, if you would just explain to us, because I don't think we've seen one of your interpretations yet, your interpreted logs. If you would just get us oriented left to right on this well log.
Certainly. So they are numbered, each track, or named by the kind of track that it is. So in the first track, it is the depth track. It just shows measured depth, not subsea, unfortunately. It also shows the pics of the tops as done by Ops Geologic. The second track is the tops as provided by Ryan from Ops Geologic. The next track is the gamma ray, which is going to be an indication of lithology along with a caliper. The next track is track 6 is the LLD and LLS. That is the lateral log. It's a resistivity curve. Scale from 0.2 to 2000 on a logarithmic scale. Next, we have neutron and density with a PE curve included. Then we have the low case pay flags to the left and the high pay flag high case to the right. So you'll notice in several cases they're similar. It's because the saturations change slightly. On the next track over, the porosity track, we see the total porosity and effective porosity, BVW, which is just the SW times porosity, and then my baffle curve to indicate where there could be baffles. The next place is lithology, where over the San Andreas, the lithology was interpreted using neutron density and PE. And then the last track was called 19 because that's called 19 is the permeability I calculated from 0.01 to 100 using the Lucia method. Thank you.
I may need reminders once we get down below the header, so when we can't see them. Okay, thank you. Just so I'm clear, the green bars over here, are these the baffle flags?
Those are yes, possible baffle flags.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And again, these are the pay flags, right? Or yeah, the pay flags, high right, low left, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then you've got your tops, and these are the tops that Ops Geologic picked for each of these intervals.
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. So just kind of cruising through here, we were talking a little bit about the gamma ray issue, or gamma ray signal, and the gamma ray is the first it's this is the gamma ray track, right? I guess the third sort of track from the left, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this green line is the gamma ray, and and there's a slight shift in the gamma ray as you work your way through the Grayberg. You get a bit of a spike of gamma ray, and then there's a shift in the gamma ray below that depth. Is that right?
Right, at the Livingston Sand.
Okay. And just so I understand, it's your understanding that is the gamma ray shift that Dr. Davidson is focusing on in his analysis, correct?
That or slightly above it.
Okay.
Yes. And it's not that huge shift. It's the minor shift between, say, 4,200 and 4,000.
Okay. That's your understanding of what he's looking at?
Yes.
Okay. All right, now I'm just going to scroll down a little bit farther because this is where I'm particularly interested in your analysis down here, okay, in the lower portion of the lower San Andreas, okay. And here I see around, around 5,000 feet and a little deeper. I'm seeing, you're interpreting a fairly high oil saturations, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk through. I would like to engage with you and talk through your interpretations for the different inputs and factors, that you've interpreted here.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you have anything to say to me about the gamma ray over here or not, but is there something that you have interpreted or something that you have to say about the gamma ray, how it influenced your interpretation in this portion of the log?
It is fairly clean. It looks like it's a cyclical environment, or like it's looks like there's a time component to it.
Those are what?
Different depositional, thin depositional environments, thin deposition.
Okay. Now, the porosity, I guess I'm going to skip over to the porosity, which I think is this log, this interval, this track here, right, that I'm highlighting.
Correct.
Okay. So I guess I'd like for you to talk to me a little bit about the porosity track here, especially in this interval where you're interpreting higher oil saturations. And just for reference, again, I think we've covered this, but it's a new day. Each of these tick marks is a 20% oil saturation or 20%. Is that right?
Yes.
And so you from left to right on this track is low oil saturation to high.
Yes, correct.
And the blue is your low case and the red is your high case.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this interval where you've interpreted and flagged both in your high and low case net pay, I'd like for you to talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing in the porosity curve here.
We see the porosity go from a fairly high value. Each of those incisions, each of those grid lines are 10 PU. So it's actually not 20 in those, it's 10 PU. So we go from about 15% porosity above, where we expect to see a fairly low oil saturation residual, to a place where the porosity drops down fairly low to around 4%, a little bit greater than 4%, where the residual oil saturation goes high because it's low porosity.
Okay. Now, in your interpretation from porosity, what are some of the input parameters or factors that would influence how you're interpreting your porosity in this curve?
It's density, neutron, and PE.
And when we talked about this earlier, I think I asked you because in terms of your density neutron, I mean, how does your dolomite matrix affect your influence here? Affect your interpretation here?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah. How does the dolomite matrix that you've selected influence your interpretation here on the porosity curve?
The dolomite matrix affects it gives slightly higher porosities given an already tight bulk density.
Okay. Now, I understood that you were using 2.9 as your factor for dolomite in your interpretation. Is that right?
Yes.
And as I understood, with a 20% value for dolomite,
About a 20% inclusion for anhydritic cements.
20% inclusion for anhydritic cement.
Yeah, or heavy minerals.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it's a ternary diagram. There's not a fourth leg to it.
It's a say that word again.
It's a ternary diagram. You have 3 points to it, one for limestone, dolomite, and sandstone. Those minerals are not arbitrary, but that's what they're based on. Sometimes you have to make adjustments for certain other heavier minerals.
Okay. And so you're okay. And what is your dolomite then matrix density that you're using?
I just mentioned within this element of a variable grain density. I'm using 2.9, assuming the anhydrite cement, 2.65 for the quartz element, and 2.71 for the limestone element.
Okay.
It takes all three of those to come up with a variable grain density.
Okay.
So the grain density of the rock itself is somewhere in between all of those.
So my understanding, and it's very cursory here, but my understanding is that for dolomites, there's a range of that's in the literature, a range of the matrix that is generally assigned between 2.83 and 2.87. Is that generally the case?
And that's why I added the other 3/10 to get to the to solve for the slightly heavier minerals.
Okay. And how did you come to use that higher 2.9 value for your dolomite matrix?
From the literature, understand that there is going to be a certain amount of anhydritic cement throughout it, and that the porosity, the UMA-ROMA cross plotted a little bit higher than dolomite, indicating that there was something heavier in there. In order to match that, you have to adjust the matrix density of the point that is closest to include and to get a correct grain density across it.
So in assessing, I mean, because you don't have core down here, right, there's some uncertainty about what values you're going to be selecting for your porosity, right?
Even with, well, there's time and tested models, but as I've said many times, in petrophysics, there is uncertainty. So I use tried and tested models for how to calculate mineralogy through this using literature to come up with my solution.
Okay. Now on the anhydrite, did you calculate for ranges of anhydrite, or did you just use a 20% for that?
And using a variable grain density, it would be jumping the shark to make a guess on the anhydrite volume throughout the entire thing. It's much better and much more reasonable to pick a baseline value because it's going to have a very little impact anyway, because it's such a small percentage of what is such a small percentage.
Okay. So based on this porosity log, let's maybe walk through it. So from 4,800 feet down, you've got it's higher from right to left, right? So the higher porosities values are this is a higher value and this is a lower value closer to this line on the right.
Yes, that is higher to lower.
Okay, so the bigger, the more blue, the more porosity.
The more to the left, the more porosity. Yes.
Okay, so the more to the left, the more porosity. Okay, so going from 4,800 feet down the track, I'm seeing relatively higher porosities, and then as I approach your higher oil saturations, I'm seeing the porosities decline, right?
Yes.
And my understanding is you're telling me that lower porosity is indicative of where the oil is going to be because the oil was trapped in those lower porosity zones.
So that's the physics.
Got it. Okay. And what's causing the shift here to lower porosity in this track?
It could be an increase in cements.
What gives you the read? I mean, in other words, what are you reading that gives you the lower porosity? And how are you reading? I mean, what's telling you there's lower porosity?
The density increases.
Okay. All right. Now I'm going to talk next about the resistivity curve. Remind me which curve is resistivity?
That would be the fourth one from the left.
Including the depth track and the formation track.
Yes. Yeah.
1, 2, after gamma ray. So this one here.
Yes.
Okay. So it's the one with the aqua and the blue.
Yes.
Okay. So my understanding is that your interpretation or your curves or your petrophysical model is more sensitive to resistivity than Dr. Davidson's. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. On the resistivity, I would like for you to do the same as we just did for the porosity and starting at about 4,800 feet. And I guess which is the high case and which is the low case?
That's not
They're
how
not.
it works.
Okay.
One is a shallower resistivity and one of them is a deeper resistivity.
Okay, which is shallow and which is deep?
The shallow should be the blue one.
Okay. So if you would just narrate for me what you're seeing in the resistivity curve as you go from 4,800 feet down through the higher oil saturation zone.
We're seeing lower resistivities through that, spiking at certain intervals and to a fairly moderate value. What I would take this to be is an indication of a zone that is mostly water bearing.
Okay, before we get into how you came to that conclusion, I would like you to just explain for me and perhaps at least one or two of the commissioners how resistivity is used to interpret the fluids in the log.
Okay, so I'd be happy to. So, and if I go on too long, let me know. So resistivity is incredibly important because it's one of the few ways through history to see what the amount of fluid is you have downhole. We do not see oil saturations downhole. We see water saturations because oil is infinitely resistive. So what we can tell is what the volume of something that is conductive within the system. So knowing the porosity, the resistivity, and the salinity, we can actually figure out what is pay or non-pay or hydrocarbon bearing or non-hydrocarbon bearing. So we basically have to have something that is conductive within the system to have a resistivity. And the more typically, if you have porosity, the more resistivity you have, the better chance you have of having hydrocarbons.
there's a lot there. And I'm going to have to just ask you to break it down. I'm going to ask you questions. I may ask you to repeat, but I'm going to work on each of those elements. Okay.
That's fine.
So, so things that are resistive, in other words, you're trying to pass electrical current through the formation, right?
Yes,
And things that are resistive don't do that as well, right?
correct.
Right. So higher resistivity means that they're not conducting electricity through the formation, right?
Well, yes, yeah.
In
layman's
very,
terms, yeah.
very simple
Yeah.
terms, yeah. Okay, and oil does not conduct electricity well, does it?
At all. Yes,
But saline water does.
it's true. Correct.
And does rock?
Depending on the rock. It depends on the rock.
Okay, so here, what's your lithology in this zone?
This is dolomite and limestone, and there's a little bit of sand in some parts of it. And what I'm interpreting as to be a moderate amount of clay.
Okay, so dolomite, limestone, and what else?
There's a little bit of sandstone showing up as the yellow, and then the rest is what's currently being interpreted as clay.
Which is the clay?
That would be the one to the outside.
That'll be the what?
Sorry, the dashed green. There's the dashed green that's more to the left side than to the right side. So if you look at the lithology track, it would be the one that's to the left side of the track, shaded.
This little band here, nearest to the left side of the track.
I can't see your cursor. Where is that? Yes.
I try to think. I guess it spikes up here a little bit, huh? Around.
Yeah, where the gamma ray goes to a higher value, that's where there's a little bit more clay interpreted.
So up here. Okay, so you're interpreting some clay above around 4,800 feet.
Yes.
Okay. Now, given that lithology in this zone between, I don't know, where the higher oil saturations are, what is your interpretation about the conductivity or resistivity of the rock there?
With the higher oil saturations.
In that zone where there is a higher oil saturation, yeah.
Okay. My interpretation is that since I am computing porosity across it, although low, and because we are looking at ROZs, and we do have very, very high resistivity, that with porosity and resistivity can be nothing else other than something that's unless it was infinitely fresh water, we would not see a reflection like that, and then it would be off the charts if it was. So this has to be some moderate amount of hydrocarbon, and because it's low porosity, it has a higher oil saturation per unit volume.
I guess I don't think that answered my question. I was asking about the rock, the resistivity of the rock here. Based on your interpretation of the lithology, what's your understanding of the resistivity of the rock, the lithology in this zone?
Yes. So I'm sorry. It was whenever you look at the rock and there's a low porosity, this rock, dolomite, limestone, does not, it is very, very resistive.
Right.
Clays are not very resistive. When you look at the dolomite and see the highly resistive rock with minor porosity tools still work. So we have a resistive rock and we have a resistive fluid within the formation.
Okay. I'm sticking with the rock here for a bit. Okay?
Yeah. It's all, so we deal with bulk volumes, and that's it's hard to deal with. If we're asking about the resistivity of the rock, the resistivity of the rock is high.
Thank you. Okay. Now, okay, so we know it's a fairly resistive rock, right?
Mainly because it's low porosity.
Okay. Now, I'd like to talk about the permeability. Okay. And I think that's the far curve. That's your Lucia curve, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, so that's the farthest curve here, the farthest right. And again, this one's a little more messy, at least for my eyes. I don't know. If you would just walk through for me what the colors are here for each curve and what they mean. And
the one to the furthest. I'm sorry for cutting you off.
it's okay. Yeah, I just want you to explain to me what the two. I think there are just two curves in there, red and blue.
There's three. I unfortunately colored two of them very close to the same color. So the curve to the left is the porous rock type. The rock type 2, the middle curve, the red curve, is rock type 2, which is the next best or moderately good. The one to the outside, to the furthest right, is the if it was the best rock type.
The furthest left, is that rock type 1?
I believe the rock type 3 is the one that I call the worst. So
Okay.
it's the one that gives the longest number. So we can go from poorest rock type to best rock type from left to right.
So it'd be 3, 2, 1.
We could go from poorest rock type to best rock type, but yes, I believe that's the way it goes.
Okay. Now that we know what curves we're looking at, which is a little hard, explain to me what we're looking at as we go from 4,800 feet down through the high oil saturation zone here.
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, now that we know what these curves are, I'm just asking you to do the same thing we did for the other two curves, and is just walk us through from 4,800 feet down through the higher oil saturation zones, explaining to me what's happening with these curves.
With the permeability curves.
Permeability.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, that's what.
Yeah.
So yes, these permeability curves were added into the interpretation to give a range. The permeability is based on literature. So classically, what you would do is you would have the data to do rock typing and core description throughout this entire thing. We don't have that in this case, and we don't have the data to do rock typing using these curves as well. So I provided all 3 perm curves to show what the possibilities were. And what it shows very directly is that as your, it's a relationship with porosity, that as porosity decreases, permeability decreases.
Okay. And so high perm is to the right, is that correct?
Correct.
And low perm's to the left.
Yes.
Okay, this is the only other option. So as we go through the high oil saturation, we see permeability going sort of off for most of the curves going off the chart to the right. And then as you approach the higher oil saturations, you're getting a substantial decrease in permeability for the most part, with some higher levels intermixed. Is that fair?
The rock type 1 goes off the charts. The chart is 100 millidarcies. The other 2 don't seem to, but yes, in general, as you get into lower porosities, the permeability goes down by nature of the equations.
Okay. Yeah, you kind of touched on it, but I guess I want to ask you to explain it. How is permeability then related to porosity?
Tenuously. And it usually needs more information. So you actually need to know what the pore distribution is. You need to know what kind of pores you have. You need to know how big the pores are. You need to know how connected they are. There's a million and one elements that go into it. But in general, you can figure out trends with porosity versus permeability when you have other identifiers to reduce them by.
I guess this kind of gets into tortuosity, understanding exactly the nature of the.
That's a bit of that. So yeah.
Okay.
So certain rock types behave different ways than others. So they'll show up on different parts of the porosity permeability cross plot.
Okay. So my understanding is then, as we consider this zone from the 4,800 foot depth down through the higher oil saturations, and I'm considering the relationship between permeability and porosity, I understand you to say that it's a tenuous relationship.
Which is why I provided 3 curves.
Okay, and so the 3 curves are intended to provide a range of interpretations or outputs. Is that right?
Yes, just keeping a long theme. It's working with ranges.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay. So based on that uncertainty about the relationship here between permeability and porosity, there's some uncertainty, as you've been saying over and over again, and that's why you're giving us the 3 rock type curves.
Yes.
Okay.
And a low and high case saturation.
Now, on the saturations, just if you would, let's go ahead and walk through that curve too. Now it's this curve here. I guess it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I guess it's the 7th from the left, right?
Yes, the one next to the pay flag track.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay. And the high again is the red, the low is the blue. Just if you would just walk through, and if you would explain to us your oil saturation interpretations as it relates to the key factors that would inform, that your determination of oil saturation.
Key factors.
Well, I mean, yeah, just tell me what you think most influence, what are the inputs that most influence, that have the greatest driver of the oil saturations?
In the upper part where there's low resistivity, the main factor that would probably impact this would be RW, the resistivity of the water.
Okay. And explain how that relates to high or low oil saturations as we go through the curve from 4,800 feet down through the higher oil saturation.
Sorry, I interrupted again. It's a main part of the Archie equation. So it's A over porosity to the M power times RW over RT. So RW is a big component of that.
Okay, but then explain to me
over.
as we go from 4,800 feet down, how that plays into your interpretation of the oil saturations.
As you increase resistivity, the RW matters less and the M and N values start to matter more. So if I was going to do a classic interpretation with this and use a typical value of M or N, that would be around 2, which is what some people do for clastic rocks or something somewhat lower. You would end up with about 5% water saturation, about 95% oil saturation. That's not realistic, but we have resistivities that are in some cases exceeding 2,000 ohms. So we have to adjust the N to bring down the oil saturation to reasonable values using the core data that we have.
Okay. Now I want to loop back again, I think here. So based on that, those, in a nutshell, what you said that very quickly, and there's a lot of material information there, but that's, my understanding is that's how you came up with your oil saturations, kind of considering all those factors.
Correct.
Okay. Now, we talked a bit about the importance of resistivity in your analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a bit about how resistivity is affected by porosity and the rock type. Okay. And as we get lower porosity, resistivity matters less, right?
Sorry?
I believe, did you say that as you get lower porosity, that resistivity matters less?
No.
What did you say? How did you phrase it? That so RW matters less. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I said as resistivity increases to infinite values, RW matters less.
I meant to say RW.
Okay.
Sorry, I apologize. Okay, so now I want to then focus on again, continue to discuss resistivity here. And this is coming from a layperson I'm trying to understand, okay? So I appreciate your patience with me, because I understand that these interpretations can be very sensitive to what factors are being employed and the how you're interpreting the importance of those factors, right? Such as resistivity, right?
Yes.
Okay. So here, in my very basic understanding of petrophysics is that you're looking for fluids, right? I mean, you're trying to understand what the fluid content is of the rock, right?
Yes, the fluid distribution, or what the fluid types are.
And with the more fluid you have, as I understand, it's a little bit easier. It's easier to interpret what's in the matrix or what's in the rock. Is that fair to say?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question?
In other words, if you have high porosity, okay, and there's more fluid in the system, would you agree with me that it's easier to interpret through petrophysics what is in the rock, whether it's oil or salt water?
No, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
In low porosities filled with water, it's pretty easy to tell.
Okay. So let me ask you then, let me think about how to phrase the question I want to ask. I guess I'll reframe it this way. So in higher porosity systems where we read high porosity, there's more fluid available to analyze, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess my question, which I think is, you don't agree with me that with less fluid, it's harder to analyze, do a petrophysical analysis if there's less fluid in the system, if there's lower porosity.
Taking, for example, let's say 4850, that is a lower resistivity, lower porosity zone.
Just so I'm on the right track.
Yeah, you're on exactly the right spot.
Okay.
You have a lower porosity of about 5 or 6%.
Okay.
It is really easy to tell that that is water bearing. So it's also easy to tell that the zones right above and below it are also water bearing.
Okay.
So, and contextually within the height of that, it's really easy to tell that all of them are water bearing.
So as in these lower, how do you, I mean, basically, how do you tell the difference then if both rock and oil are resistive, right?
Mhm.
How do you tell the difference between oil and rock?
By knowing the porosity
Okay.
and
And
knowing the salinity of the fluid.
Okay. So, and if you know the porosity, if the porosity is low, then how does that help you interpret whether it's oil or rock?
Because the resistivity tool is sensitive enough and the equations are sensitive enough to be able to tell the difference. And with the MNN to guide what the impacts of the rock are, which is what how you basically impact the how the rock is affecting the resistivity, you can figure out the volumes of the fluids pretty easily.
Hmm. But you're manipulating the MNN values based on the literature.
Based on literature, as I said before, and the N value is based upon trying to stay within reasonable values based on literature and on mixed wet to oil wet systems and based upon the core data.
Okay, but we don't have any core data down here, right?
We sure don't.
Okay. So how, I mean, there's some level, I mean, you've agreed with me all along on the uncertainty. There's some level of uncertainty here, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And does that uncertainty increase with lower porosity intervals with less fluid?
So I'll put it in this perspective. It is not uncertain that the zone at 4850 is wet, regardless of the porosity, because the resistivity is incredibly low.
Okay.
There is slightly more uncertainty when you get up into several hundred ohms, and it's lower porosity.
So I guess let me ask you this way. In this zone here where you calculated 20, 40, 60, 80, upwards, that's, you know, up on your high side, above 80% oil saturations, right?
And yes, and 4% porosity rock.
Okay. So in this interval of how many feet is this? How many feet is this here?
Each one is, I believe, 50 feet.
So about 100 feet
Mhm.
of rock. You're calculating upwards of 20, 40, 60. So on the high side, above 60%, and in your low case, well above 40%.
With you looking just at the high case, yes.
Well, I'm looking at the low case, the blue case, right?
No, because then you'd be going down close to 20%. If I'm looking at this correctly over the entire interval, the blue curve goes down to about 25% oil saturation, possibly 30% oil saturation. The red curve starts at about 40. The red curve on the right goes a little bit over 80, as you suggested, and goes down to around 40, actually to about 25 as well in one part, giving an average of around 30 to 40% oil saturation.
30 to 40% oil saturation for which case?
30 to 40 for the low case and just a little bit higher than that for the high case. Because the majority of the volume is in the big pores. And that adds more, the oil saturation, although lower, offers more hydrocarbon pore volume.
So if I draw a line right down the middle, I see a fair number of spikes on the high side above 50%, right?
I see a few, yes.
Okay.
I would say that the lion's share of those, again, just eyeballing it, there's a larger percentage that are to the left,
Okay.
especially with the blue curve. With the blue curve, most of them are.
I mean, how certain are you, Mr. Burkhead, that there's even any oil in this interval?
I'm pretty certain if we go back to the 679 core data, we'll see at the very top of the log where there are very, very low porosities, and the measured oil saturations in those are like 70, 80%.
Is it possible, Mr. Burkhead, that there may not even be any oil in this zone?
If there is porosity and resistivity, there is oil.
Okay. Now there's lower porosity and there's highly resistive rock, and you're confident that you can distinguish between the high resistivity rock and oil in this low porosity system?
Because of the high resistivities and because there is porosity, you have to fight this to make it not the biggest find of the year.
So I understand that often in carbonate systems, there's often a false positive where you have low porosity because of that very issue. Is that your
No.
understanding as well?
No, that's not my understanding at all.
Okay.
In fact, I've worked in low porosity carbonates. It's not that, yeah. Please, yeah.
Okay. Now, we talked previously about, and you talked at length in your written testimony and in your summary about the importance of reviewing all the available data when you're making your petrophysical interpretations, right?
Yes.
And we talked about mud logs, we talked about, whatever may be available, including well tests, production tests, to determine, whether or not your petrophysical analysis is reasonable or makes sense, right?
Yes.
Okay. And here we do have a mud log, and I'm going to pull it up and we can talk through it, and I'd like you to explain to me. Second, I can't see. My eyesight's getting worse and worse. Oh, that's why I'm in the wrong folder. So the mud log's long, okay, and I didn't include the whole mud log, but I'm including the section here that we were just reviewing, and this is from the division's well file, and I've included a snippet from the top of the mud log so we can identify and confirm that it's the same well. See that it says XTO EMSU 746.
Yep.
In the Eunice Monument South, it's got the API number. Do you agree with me that and I think you've reviewed this mud log as well, right?
Yes.
And does that look like the mud log for this well? As far as you can tell?
As far as I can tell.
Yeah, no reason to dispute it as you sit here today.
Right.
So I've then taken a snippet out of the mud log for the interval that we were looking at, which is just a little bit above 5,000 feet down to a little below 5,100 feet. Mm-hmm. And I've highlighted the language just to point out that in throughout this interval, the mud logger has identified that there's no fluorescence, no cut, 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 all the way down through the entire interval here. So I'm wondering how, when I go back to your interpretation of as high as 80% in the high case, how did that mud log help you interpret high oil saturations in that particular interval?
For one, lack of shows is not evidence of no shows at all. You can have lack of shows from the mud logger. If we go back to the connection gas and go back to the gas log, please.
Yeah.
Aside from the connection gas, which again is related to whenever they're putting the pipes together, we see increases in gas throughout this entire thing. So just because they didn't see it doesn't mean it's not there. We have other elements of evidence, which is what all I was saying about petrophysical integration. We have logs, we have porosity, we have resistivity. We have gases that are moving on this. And if there's not oil down there or gas, then what is making it read that? So we have direct evidence of hydrocarbons in this mud log.
Okay. So this is a gas chromatograph on the right, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the gas chromatograph is reading some high levels of, or are they high levels of gas on that you're talking about here?
For a residual oil zone, you would not expect a high level of gas. You'd expect some level of gas.
Okay.
If you're overbalanced, you would expect no level of gas.
So as you looked at this mud log, you were informed by the gas chromatograph.
I can't speak to this log directly. What I was thinking whenever I interpreted the 746, that's what, looking at it now, it has clear indications of gas. I've drilled through wells that are in billion barrel fields that have no gas shows. They do have some gas shows, or are overbalanced and don't have any fluorescence.
So let me just make clear. I mean, you don't recall how this mud log influenced your interpretation, but looking at it now, you're looking at the gas and that. I just want to make sure, like,
Yeah.
Did you specifically review this mud log and
I
evaluate? Hold on, let me just finish.
Yeah.
Did you specifically evaluate this mud log and evaluate it as part of your interpretation of your petrophysical analysis?
I interpreted 29 wells.
Yeah.
I cannot speak directly to exactly which mud logs I looked at, just from the top of my head. So given time to go back and see which ones I had access to, I could easily answer that question.
Well, it's curious to me that when you interpret oil saturations that high, that far down and isolated from any other saturations, that it wouldn't have caused you to look specifically at the mud log to determine whether that made sense.
From what I understand, and you can speak to Mr. Bailey or some others about this, but there is a well-known pay sand that is down close to the bottom of the San Andreas that does occur. So this is not completely unique in its occurrence. Aside from the fact that, yes, we use the data we have, resistivity, porosity, and in this case, what you've shown me is the mud logs, which also support it.
Okay. Now, obviously, XTO had this mud log as well, right? And they reviewed it and they considered it.
Mm-hmm.
And they went ahead and when they drilled this well, they went ahead and perfed this zone, right? Did you, as you were preparing this mud log, making your interpretation, evaluate the well file and the test information from this well?
No, but I have seen you put it up here in the past 2 days.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and pull it up again and we can just talk through it. And I'm going to pull up a slightly different version of it. This is in Goodnight's exhibit. I think this is B33 from Preston McGuire's. I believe this is direct testimony. Just to confirm, I'm going to scroll down and just show you that. Oh, yeah, man, you can't see that. But in any event, this exhibit sticker down here, it just says it's Goodnight's exhibit B33. Okay. So now this slide, Mr. Burkhead, is not your interpretation, but it's Newtek's original interpretation that they filed in August of 2024. Okay, because that's what we had and we understood was Empire's interpretation of the zone until you filed your rebuttal testimony. So as I scroll through Newtek's interpretation here, I believe this and I will confirm this in a moment. This is what I believe is Goodnight's interpreted San Andreas top. Okay, I believe that's to be the case.
Okay.
That is the case. So I'll represent to you that as Goodnight's interpreted San Andreas top. Okay.
I'll take your,
Okay. So
Excuse me, Adam, I'm not clear as to what exhibit you're looking at. Can you tell us?
It's Exhibit B33.
33, okay. And that's for the well log? The
This is
Institute-
new text interpretation of the 746.
Right, and the previous one that was filed with OCD?
Thank you. I haven't moved for the emission of that yet.
Well, I'm just wondering where it came from, because I don't find it in the OCD WAL file.
It's in the OCD log file. It's the mud. Is it? No, actually, it's from you guys. You gave it to us. It is Bates number 23614-17 0397. You provided that to us in discovery. Just
Thank you.
don't let me forget.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is Exhibit B33 from Goodnight's direct testimony. And as I mentioned, this is the Goodnight's interpreted San Andreas top. And in blue are the perforated intervals from the OCD well log, okay? So the portion of the interval that we're most interested in is not this one, but I'm going to scroll down to the, it's a little hard to see the depth track, so I'm going to zoom in until we can see it. Okay, 4,500, 4,800, sorry, 4,700, 4,800. So here we are in the area of interest, okay? I see Inutech also interpreted fairly high oil saturations through this zone as well. And these are the calculated average oil saturations on the left-hand side for each of those intervals that were perforated by XTO according to the well logs, according to the well file. On the right-hand side, between the bracket here, which indicates the top and bottom perfs that were tested, is the well tests from the well file. You'll see on September 19th, 2005, XTO perfed from 5130 to 5138, perfed 24 holes, and then from 5100 to 5110. I think that's 30 holes. And then from 5030 to 5050 is 60 holes, 4990 to 5000, 30 holes. And then they acidized the perfs with 3,000 gallons of 50% acid, and they flowed and swabbed 110 barrels of water in 2 days and had no gas reported. And then they went ahead and set a cast iron bridge plug. Now, I understand that, you know, the gas chromatograph showed there may have been some gas, but it sounds like there was no gas produced as a result of this test. When you're, based on these saturations that you have here, and I think I know your answer, I can anticipate it. I can feel it coming. But based on these high saturations, wouldn't you have expected that with this swabbing, you would have gotten some oil to flow?
So they acidized perfs with 3,000 gallons of fluid, then flowed and swabbed 110 barrels back in 2 days. Yeah, I'm not saying that the residual gas and the residual oil and the low porosity equates to a large volume of oil, but it sounds like they didn't produce it very long to get most of their load back. So 3,000 gallons ends up being quite a bit, flowing back 110 barrels. So I'd say they probably should have flowed it for longer just to be sure.
Okay.
Residual gas doesn't give up very easily unless it's being drilled through. So if you're not drilling through it, it's kind of hard to see it.
$110 barrels. Okay, so you're saying that you don't think that it was depressurized, the in situ reservoir conditions were not altered sufficiently to permit that oil in that tight porosity to flow?
If we're talking about a residual oil zone, absolutely. They did not provide enough pressure on, yes, that would be the clear result of the test.
Okay.
Again, residual oil.
Um, on the mud log, this, just, you know, I've never actually been to watch a mud logger work.
Mhm.
Someday I hope to. But my understanding, right, is when a mud log is being taken, essentially the mud logger is set up and the gas chromatograph is set up and the drillings are coming back up whole and the mud logger is reviewing the materials and then it's also being processed through the gas chromatograph, right?
The gas is constantly processed through the mud system. Yes.
Okay. So, and that, because it's being done while the hole is open, is it not possible that, or is it possible that some of the other shallower zones in which there are hydrocarbons, because they're open to the wellbore, some of the gas being read here could be from those other zones?
Absolutely. But the resistivity can't be from above those zones. The resistivity is from there and the porosity is from there.
Okay.
There is recycled gas, which back then they weren't really measuring.
Right. And we talked about how this rock in particular in this zone is resistive, right?
Absolutely. Yes. All rocks, unless they're clays and conductive, are resistive.
Okay. Now, in your testimony, I'm going to move back up here to sorry. Oh, yeah. Mr. Hearing Officer, before I forget, I'd like to move the admission of will be Goodnight Midstream Cross Exhibit number 4, which is this 746 mud log. And I have a few, I'm a little backlogged and I have a few of these exhibits I need to circulate to all the parties and I'll try to get to that this evening.
It's a one-page document, 00397 Bates stamp.
Correct.
Any objection from Empire?
No, so long as it is a one-page document.
Right.
And if it's not, that the entire document be submitted as an exhibit.
Well, it's in the, I mean, this is, if you like, I mean, I guess you can come back and submit the whole thing, but this is my exhibit. So I'm going to move the admission of this exhibit, which is a part of the mud log that we were discussing, in particular, reviewing Mr. Burkhead's analysis of this particular section of the zone.
Okay, so it's one page.
This is
Empire
one
would,
page. What Empire produced is a very long mud log of the whole entire well bore.
Okay.
an Empire would request that the entire mud log be included as an exhibit rather than an excerpt from the mud log.
They can introduce it if they'd like.
Well, I mean, there is a rule on it. I mean, you introduce part, they get to introduce the rest of it.
That's fine.
So with that understanding, OCD, do you oppose the introduction of this page and the remainder of the mud law?
No, Mr. Hearing Officer, and I agree with your ruling from the standpoint with the rule of completeness that that Empire can put the whole document in later
Sure.
if they so choose.
All right, Mr. Beck.
Sorry, Matt.
No objection.
And Mr. I never know who it is for pilot.
No objections, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Is that Mr. Suazo's voice?
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So, all right, it'll be admitted.
So before I leave the 746, Mr. Burkett, I'm going to pull up Mr. Davidson's interpretation of the 746. This is from his testimony. And you've reviewed Mr. Davidson's analysis of this well?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I'm going to scroll down to the interval that we were looking at here. Along the depth track here, we've got the portion of the wellbore that has been perforated by XTO. That's represented by this blue bar. And then we've got I think this is lithology, and then his oil saturation interpretations. Based on what we've reviewed from the mud log and the well test data, with his oil saturations largely below 20% with some elevated levels, do you not agree that this is a more reasonable interpretation of this particular zone based on what we know, based on all the data and information that we reviewed and have available to us, including the mud log and the well file from the well test data?
Absolutely not. If you look at the resistivity just above that, we see a low resistivity, and we see some of the same porosities across that. We see a low resistivity there, and we see the same porosities below with a much, much higher resistivities. If you're going to choose an RW, you can only pick one for one interval. So if that's not changing between the two sands, then there has to be a fluid difference between the two. The fact that they flowed water out of the perforation just shows that it does have porosity and permeability, and that it should have the same resistivity as what the above section does.
So that's your basis for believing or taking the position that his is not as reasonable an interpretation as yours.
He's not following the data.
And the specific data you're pointing to is the resistivity curve?
The resistivity and the porosity.
Okay. Now, going back to your testimony, you did choose to select a portion of the 746 log to highlight in Exhibit L20, right?
Looks like I did, yes.
But you didn't choose the portion that we were just talking about, right?
I was mostly focused in this description on the upper part and looking at the difference in tops. So that's why I chose this part.
Okay. So this portion was selected not necessarily to address the oil saturations, but to show the tops.
To show the tops and how the difference in interpretation between, like I said, it's the low and high, and it does have Dr. Davidson's interpretation on it as well. So yes, that was the main purpose.
Okay, just so I'm clear, because I don't think I did quite understood it. I didn't ask you before. What is the SWT?
That is the total water saturation. That's the one that we're using to calculate the oil saturation.
Okay. Okay, and the difference between track 20 from track 19?
Track 19 has a calculated SWE from IP. The only reason I included that is because Dr. Davidson never explained what his SW was from. He never explained whether it was total or effective. So I included my calculated effective just as a comparison.
Okay. And, we talked about this from the mud log portion that we looked at for our interval, but, I think in this previous slide or one or two slides above, I think you included some excerpts or a page which is from, I think, Mr. Melzer's ROZ cookbook, which identifies potential indicators of an ROZ, right?
Yes.
I mean, the lack of fluorescence and no cut in the mud log, how does that fit into Mr. Melzer's ROZ cookbook?
It's a checklist. It's not an absolute thing, but it doesn't, that those things are indicators and his positive indicators and his checklist.
So the lack of those things would be a potential negative indicator, right?
Not necessarily.
I guess trying to use the language, it's a potential negative indicator. Not necessarily, it doesn't mean it's not there. It's a negative indicator.
It's a neutral indicator.
A neutral indicator. Okay. Well, I guess that's fair because almost everything on Mr. Melzer's chart seems to suggest you'll find ROZ somewhere, right? So there's very few things that say negative, right?
Objection to Mr. Rankin testifying.
Okay.
It doesn't seem like a question. Mr.
Yeah, that's
Rankin.
fair.
It's
That's
more of a
fair.
comment.
That's fair. I'll have a chance to talk to Mr. Melzer about it in a little bit. All right, going back to your testimony. You suggest here that, and I'm going to talk to the first highlighting here, that the testimony from Dr. Davidson's deposition clearly states that they did not look into uncertainty. But why do you say, what's your view? I mean, why do you say that? What's your basis for that position?
I would have to go back and look at the quote, but that is one of the things I looked at that he said he didn't look into. So I'd have to go back and look at the, reread that to find the quote.
Okay. And you didn't have a chance to really look at his rebuttal testimony, did you?
Not very long, no.
Okay. Now the next one here, regardless of on the same page, this is page 9 of your testimony. Regardless of the St. Andrews, the agreement of oil saturation, the Grayburg clearly suggests successful migration through the St. Andrews at a minimum, and at other levels, reservoir storage, in parentheses, nature's water flood. Are you suggesting here that oil migrated from the basin through the San Andreas into the Grayburg?
I'm saying it's very likely.
Okay. Is it your understanding based on the system here that okay, so that you think oil migrated through the San Andreas into the Grayburg? That's your understanding of the migratory pathway ultimately?
That's not, it's a complex path. So
Yeah.
it migrated through the San Andreas and also up fractures, faults, and other fairways to get into the Grayburg. So there's multiple pathways from the Wolfcamp oil into that system. But yes, there's nothing in the way to keep the oil from migrating from the San Andreas to the Grayburg.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the last bit of my examination of you, and I'm going to talk about the 520, the North Monument Unit 522 well, which I think you get down into paragraph 11 here. Get there. Okay. I think it's paragraph 26. You say that the NMGSAU number 522 does show residual, in parentheses, ROZ level hydrocarbons in all different slopes presented in the plot.
Mhm.
This means that whatever rock type exists, there can still be an oil saturation greater than 20%. Did you review the well file for this well?
I have. Since I wrote this.
Okay, yeah, that was you anticipated
Yeah.
my question. So at the time you conducted your analysis and prepared this testimony, you had not reviewed the well file, correct?
I had not.
Okay. And at the time you prepared your testimony and this analysis, had you reviewed the drilling records?
Had I looked for everything I could find on it at the time. I think since then I've looked at the OCD records and found some things that I hadn't seen before.
Okay. Did you review to see if they production tested the interval that you're referring to in your
Yes.
analysis subsequent to this testimony?
Yes.
Okay, but at the time of the testimony, you had not.
No, I believe I had done too, that part of it.
Okay. And you're aware that the operator went back and they tested 100% water?
Yes.
Okay. Where the core was showing as high as 60 to 70% oil saturation?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the core, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, and that was a conventional core, right?
Yes.
And now you're saying that core is the lowest the saturation could be, so those numbers should be higher.
I would say that there are special circumstances where that's not true.
Okay.
Yes, I know where you're going with this.
Well, I mean,
We know where each other are going with this.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you've become aware that Apache has now tested that interval and immediately abandoned it, right?
Yes.
And they've set a bridge plug and they've moved back and they've not pursued that zone.
Yes.
Now, before I let you go, Mr. Burkhead, we talked a little bit at the beginning, and you told me you've only just done a cursory review of Newtek's analysis, but is it your opinion that what you did, your analysis, is different than what Newtek did?
My analysis, the purpose was to establish a range of oil saturations across the interval that were reasonable for what is equivalent to a P10 or P90 evaluation. So the purpose of my evaluation was totally different from what Newtek's was. Newtek has their own petrochemical method. There are more than one ways to skin a cat. Just because they used a different method does not necessarily make it wrong. Is it the way I would have done it? Maybe not.
Okay. But you told me that you weren't aware or didn't know, but I'm just going to represent to you that if they had calibrated their log analysis to water saturations in the 679 core, that's not what you did, right?
That is not what I did.
And you haven't evaluated the inputs or parameters that Newtek used in its analysis, right?
Not in detail.
Okay. You know that they use varying M and N values?
I know that I believe over different zones, they use different M's and different N's.
Do you know, are they the same M and N values in the same zones and the same variations that you used?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think in some they probably match because the 2.3, I believe they used in some of it based on that 4-county study. In other areas, they are probably going to vary a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, they only use the four different M and N values, right?
It could be. I don't remember that. I don't know the exact number they use.
But you referenced that study and do you recall that there are only 4 different M and N values?
Well, you mentioned earlier, I did read that, and you did mention before that they used 2.3 from that 4-county study.
Okay.
When, yes, I am somewhat familiar with it.
Okay. And because of the different parameters and different inputs that Newtek used than what you used, that would lead to a different interpretation or different interpretation methods.
The different methods lead to different methods.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess there's one other thing I want to just touch on before I do let you go. Apologize, but here in paragraph 32 on page 12, you say in this study, your study, right? When you say in this study, it's your study, right?
Yes.
Okay. It is rare to find the San Andreas capped by an anhydrite or anhydritic dolostone with no porosity that would significantly baffle the flow between the San Andreas and Grayburg. Did I read that right?
Yes. Okay.
And you're talking about, when you say the San Andreas and Grayburg, you're talking about OPS Geologics San Andreas top, right?
I would say either, but in this case, I was talking about the Ops Geologic top.
Okay. Have you identified any evidence confirming communication between Goodnight's disposal zone and the intervals above?
Looking at the petrochemical logs, the fact that there is an ROZ above and below the sequence boundary, I would say, yes, there is quite a bit of evidence that there's some communication between them from a log perspective.
I'm confused because I thought this was a different ROZ in the lower San Andreas. Are you saying that they're related?
We never talked about that. We've been talking about the ROZ and the San Andreas.
Are you saying that this is one continuous ROZ?
I'm saying there are different elements. That one is as Dr. Meltzer will talk about, the way that ROZs are positioned are different, but yes, there can be two stacked ROZs.
In this
They're green
case,
and brown
is
ones.
your interpretation that from the Grayburg down through the base of the San Andreas, it's a single ROZ?
I don't know enough to say that.
Do you see any?
They could have undergone different parts of nature's water flood.
Okay. Well, were there different, I mean, I'm confused, I guess. What do you mean by different parts of nature's water flow?
I don't know. I'm not. And from a log perspective, there is a continuous saturation of hydrocarbons from the top of the San Andreas, and then in the Grayburg, the saturations increase. That would lead me to believe that there is a continuous batch of hydrocarbons from the San Andreas to the Grayburg. There is nothing, however, to indicate that there is a boundary or a baffle or a testable barrier between the two that would seal the San Andreas rock from the Grayburg.
This is Mr. Bailey's Exhibit K12, and I'm looking at it. It's a cross section. And I'm trying to figure out how this shows that there, with two of these logs that were included in this cross section, I don't see any indication of continuous oil saturations in at least two of them.
Oh,
Do you agree?
let me see. Well, there's at least one of them where the interpretation doesn't continue up into it. Let me get situated with the curves. Can you zoom into the tracks? Look and see what the track names are. So S oil is on the right. Okay, you can zoom back out now, please. You've included almost no part of the Grayburg above it, but yes, there's a some area above the immediate Grayburg where there's not oil saturation in that point.
Just to be clear,
We may be disputing the definition of continuous.
Mr. Burkett, this is your OPS Geologics exhibit, not ours.
It's Ryan's,
Right,
and
yeah.
so I have the ability to ask for you to zoom in, please. That's
No, I know, but I think you said I thought you were saying that we had cut off some part of the Grayburg.
No, I'm just saying that if you're trying to make a point with this, there's at least one well that doesn't have any Grayburg interpretation in it.
Okay, I guess I'm interested in what is potentially the disposal zone here, and I'm not seeing continuous oil saturations through the disposal zone.
Can you please define the disposal zone?
Lower San Andreas.
Your question was about the San Andreas Grayburg, so this is a change in direction. Okay.
Well, okay, I guess I'm wondering how you're seeing continuous oil saturations down through the San Andreas.
And several of the logs, that's what we see. There are areas that are there is no ROZ where the saturations are not as continuous, and others where they are. I was not submitting that the lower San Andreas, the upper San Andreas, and the Grayburg were all connected.
Thank you. No further questions, Mr. Examiner.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin. So, Mr. Melander, you're up if you have questions.
I have no questions for this witness, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Mr. Beck,
No questions.
Mr. Suazo.
No questions.
All right. Mr. Rosatos or whoever wants to go first on the commission.
I actually do have a few questions. So commissioners, if you don't mind if I start? Okay. Thank you again, Mr. Burkhead. We appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
And thank you for waiting patiently this morning as well.
I understand.
We appreciate all that. In cross-examination with Mr. Rankin, you remember you were talking about, the resistivity between the rock and the oil and
Yes,
the
sir.
water. Okay. You made a statement that kind of piqued my curiosity. You were talking about how oil has infinite resistivity and how you can tell how much oil is in by the amount of resistivity that you see and through the porousness of the rock and what resistivity is coming through with oil, water, rock, etc. You stated the equations are sensitive enough to distinguish oil and rock, high resistivity rock, and it was an exhibit L26. Can Ms. Hardy or Ms. Shaheen, can you bring up L26, please? Just to refresh your memory. as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My question is just going to be, can you just please, I am by no means a petrophysicist, nor a geologist, nor a hydrologist. So once they bring it up, if you wouldn't mind just kind of walking me through that
Sure.
one as well.
Happy to.
And just as a reminder, Ms. Hardy was L26. And thank you for bringing it up for me. No, please. I caught you off guard. I apologize. Of course. Everybody gets that at the same time.
Mr. Rankin, maybe you could bring it up. The two of you could duel.
I think Ms. Hardy has it.
Okay.
I'm more than happy to help.
26. So just scroll, no, the other way. That one's 27. There you go. So we were focused, Ms. Hardy, if you wouldn't mind just zeroing in on about the 4,800 to 5,200 foot depth. That was where Mr. Rankin was at. A little more. There you go. It was right about in there. Could you just explain this one for me as well, please?
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you take, let's say you take a block of rock, just a cube of rock, and try and take the resistivity of that. The resistivity is going to be extremely high. It's solid rock, no empty volume inside of it.
Okay.
You start adding a little bit of empty volume to it, and you put oil into it. It's still going to read an infinite resistivity. The only way you can start telling if there's the only way to add any conductivity to the rock is to start adding something that is conductive, such as salt water.
Sure.
So the resistivity tool is looking for a way to make it through the rock to the other side. So it's actually applying an electric current going through the rock and being measured on the other side. That when you look at the resistivity comparative to the resistivity of a water-filled zone, at the resistivity of the water itself, you can start getting an idea of what the saturation of the water versus the other side of the component is, the other side of the pore space, which would be oil or gas or something like that.
Okay.
So what you need is a conductive element to go through it. How you correct for the rock effects is because the resistivity is the conductivity is going to go through the pore space, not just the rock. We're going to see the conductivity go through the most conductive areas. We use things called saturation exponents and cementation exponents. This is the M and the N. We've been talking about this entire time.
Sure.
One of it is the N is related to basically how much the resistivity can vary between RW and the true formation resistivity and what saturation you have. The M is basically how connected up the pores are. So how much of a straight line they're in. So if you're in a straight line, your M can be very low. If you're in a very complex pore network like this, it can be just crazy. And you can get up to really high values like 4 up to 5 on the M's, where typically they're between like 1.6 and 2.1 or so.
Okay. And I get that those are coefficients that you're using. In here and on what we're looking at on the screen, you stated that the dash lines are clay, correct? The green dash on the far
yes.
left?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you have some clay down there. And just help me, let me just take one more step back. I apologize. This is a core that you've taken out of and you're doing resistivity on it?
No, I'm sorry. That's a great question. This is actually a borehole that we've dropped tools into to measure the resistivity
Got it.
and do all of the measurements on.
Okay, so
So-
that's how you're seeing this graph.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, I'm back with that one. Okay, thank you for explaining that one. I appreciate it. And that was, I think, the part that I was missing, that this is
problem.
happening down a bore hole at
Yes,
some
sir.
point. Okay. And could you just explain to me as well, you just here at the very end of your cross-examination with Mr. Rankin, you said that there's a continuous oil saturation from the Grayburg down to the San Andres, and I may have missed something somewhere there. Could you explain that one for me,
So
please?
I wasn't sure quite where it came from either because I don't recall it coming up in previous questions exactly.
Okay.
The continuity of the Grayburg to the San Andres. But if you look at this, the Grayburg section where it is interpreted, where I've shown that Dr. Davidson's interpretation is similar to mine, it's showing an oil saturation.
Okay, so that's what you're doing. You're looking at both of them, yours and the
Yes.
doctor's.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. No more questions for me. Thank you. Turn your microphone on, Mr. Hearing Officer. Sorry.
Mr. Lampkin, you want to take the next questions?
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Burkhead.
Afternoon.
Thank you for your testimony. I think I just have one question. So on all the wells that you had petrophysical data on through logs or whatever, did you utilize that data from every single well to backstop your M and N values across your modeling?
No, what I had was the core data to calibrate to. So core data and literature. I'll put it this way. The RW, the M, and the N are knobs. If you have data for one, you can vary the other two. If you have data for none, you're pretty much hung up and having to model things to calibrate to what the real data you have, which in this case is the core saturations. So we have indications of what the RW should be from the waterline logs, where we have the low resistivity and the porosity. We don't have exact cases of M and N except from literature. From N, we have even less than that. So the N was varied to fit the to calibrate to the core data low and high case.
Got you. Thank you.
Sure.
And Dr. Ampoma.
Oh, I just have one question to follow up with that.
Sure.
I'm having difficulty now with the M and N being potential
Oh, thank you.
knobs.
Yeah, that was perhaps-
I know that was just an illustration, but
Yeah.
now try to help me understand
Right.
how you're adjusting these numbers. Because it kind of now sounds like you're fitting these numbers.
A part of what this is realistically a fit to the core data. We're calibrating the core data, calibrating to the core data. The core data is a fit. That's the data that we're including into it that we're integrating. So what we're doing is we're using what you would normally do is use a resistivity versus or SW versus porosity. Just trying to remember what the picket plot is at the moment. Whenever you change any of the values, M or N, all the other values change too. So we have one value we can absolutely tie to, and that was the RW, and which does vary per well. For the M and N, if we changed RW, what we were going to need to use for M is going to change too. What we're going to use for N is going to change a little bit too. So we do calibrations to the core data because that's what's considered to be a good petrophysical model. And we don't have, and the important part is we do not have measured SCAL data, special core analysis data of porous plate pressure, cap pressure data to show us what the M and N actually should be. When we get that data, if we have that data, we could easily tell you what the M and N would be and how it would vary across the reservoir.
Okay, so in theory, there are wells out there that have that sort of data, so you could get a more concrete M and N.
If we could find more data that had that SCAL information for the M, it would be more important. The N is wettability is the wettability is important, which is on a field by field basis, and that would change per field.
Okay, so just so I get it straight, we did not have that sort of data with these wells that you wrote your paper on, or your equations on, and so the M and the N are more variable.
They are variable based upon the literature and based upon the calibration, the core data.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Ampoma.
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions for you.
I thought you might.
Probably have like 4 pages or something like that. Okay, just kidding. Okay. You know, you have analyzed quite a number of logs within the area that we are focusing on.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you, do you know that this San Andreas formation that we're dealing with, mostly if I look at the logs, mostly the lower San Andreas, it's more or less classified as an aquifer. Have you heard about that?
I do think the majority of the San Andreas ROZ is closer to the top, but there are definite indications throughout the few logs we had going through the lower San Andreas that an ROZ is there.
Now, I'm just saying that, have you heard that the San Andreas, the lower San Andreas, has been more or less assumed as an aquifer?
Oh, that is my impression.
That's your impression.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I keep on going back to this. Maybe this is the first wells that we are probably dealing with. But let me ask you, so within this ROZ, let's say the San Andreas that we're talking about here, do you believe that, let's say, these higher numbers that you are interpreting, you know, based on your analysis, is really more or less, if these higher oil saturations are more or less realistic, would you believe or would you agree that is it XT or any other companies will probably not drill water wells within these areas?
I would assume that they have done the research, know that it's residual oil and that it's okay to do that. But I can't look into I haven't looked into the past to see what the case was. So I can't speak to that.
Okay. And we will come to the log that you are going back and forth with Mr. Rankin and then our chair, where you are predicting about more like, let's say, significant amount of oil saturation, about 80%, 60, 70%. You know, so if you use that as an example, I mean, with that amount of oil in there, who is going to drill a water well through that?
That is in porosity that is about 4%. That is not going to flow under normal conditions.
Okay, we'll come to that one.
That's that, please. Yeah.
Let's go to L15, if you can bring it up. L15, I do have some questions there. Just a quick one. L15. Yeah, right there. I don't know. Okay. Okay. So you more or less utilize this to estimate your high and then the low. So with this, maybe I missed it. Can you explain to the commission how the corrections were applied, especially to the higher?
Absolutely. So it was because we don't have a good depth shift on the core and an actual gamma ray to go along with it to do a fine-tuned depth shift. Cross-plotting on this is going to be highly suspect. So a lot of this was visual, looking at the minimum, what we know as the minimum possible oil saturation from the core. These are the results of that. So these are the log curves placed on a cross plot. So this is not the core data. But then, so I matched the low case to what the minimum possible oil saturation was. And it was more like the maximum of the minimum is what I matched it to, understanding that there will be a further correction for the lost oil.
So this one is not based on core data.
No, that is not the core data that you're looking at. That is the wireline data.
That's a wireline data.
Yes.
Do you have any exhibit to show us, the data that you actually use to establish the correction factor or the correction equation?
If we can go back to my talk from this morning, I can show that plot. If that's, I believe it was the third or fourth slide. So, yes.
So can you, if you guys are going to have the conversations, remember we need to have the microphones on, but the conversation should be coming through the hearing examiner.
Mr. Examiner, hearing officer, the conversation I was having offline with Ms. Shaheen was simply, I think it's a plot that was presented in the summary presentation that we hadn't yet seen. So I just was asking Ms. Shaheen if she would, at her convenience, share the presentation so we had a copy of it.
I believe it's slide 9.
We're happy to share that with you.
Yeah. So if we look at this, sorry. If we look at this, it's 679, and you'll see from the green dots on the left-hand side that there are spots where the core saturation matches and doesn't match. That my low case saturation is in red. The core uncorrected saturation, oil saturation is in green. And yeah, there's definitely going to be parts where it doesn't match well, and others it matches very well, especially in the ops geologic area of the St. Andreas. So what I did was looking at the core oil saturation, match it to the maximum of the minimum data to show what the to come up with a low case, because this does require a variable n and variable m. The correction that I applied is in the next track over in track 10. And that correction shows just about a maybe 10 unit, maybe in 5 unit in cases correction. So the correction I apply is actually very minor to this, only resulting in a change in average between the cases of about 30 to 40%. So, and that correction was done using the B sub O of 1.3 and the ERGBA calculation from, I believe, 1988. That's in my references, but it just uses a calculation for fluid loss and something based on the B sub O.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll come to the M and N, but essentially, so the output of the correction factors will be, is it the M and the N from this? Like, let's say from 9 to 10, what were the transformation factors?
So from 9 to 10 for the core data, or
from the core data?
For the core data, it was an equation. It was an equation based on the B sub O, and it was an equation by ERGBA from 1988 or so. I can show you that equation. It's a simple rule of thumb equation similar to the one Dr. Davidson used.
Yeah, and that equation will give you?
It gives you about a 5 to 10% difference in oil saturation.
Okay.
And so N was varied in order to go from one case of saturation to the next case of saturation, going from a linear to a nonlinear model on N, but both were varied.
Okay. Thank you for that. But I thought from the earlier testimony, probably, I don't know if Dr. Lindsay touched on that, or probably Ryan touched on that or not, but it sounded to us, I think probably Ryan, talking about you use analogous data from somewhere where they applied the squeegee saturation measurement to help establish that. where you
So
established
those,
the 10%.
yeah, so I reviewed that. That was not, I did not make just a bulk calculation based upon that paper from Seminole Field. I actually used a calculation from the 80s that was specifically meant for residual oil.
So not just necessarily the Seminole Field.
Right. So it was, I'm not sure. I mean, they use corrections from taking conventional core all the way to a sponge core, and that was their correction. I don't know what their exact environment was like and what our environment was like at the time. So I had to go with more of a rule of thumb. But when I looked at both, they're fairly similar. And I think ours is a little more conservative.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that because I had a little bit of a concern on that one.
Yeah.
So based on the cross-examination from Mr. Rankin, it sounds like there's another company, New Tech, that did another petrophysical analysis. And I'm sure probably we'll have the opportunity to get to that. But let me ask you, what are the main assumptions that you utilize in your analysis?
The main assumptions that go into this is how much above the minimum oil is actually the right amount.
How much minimum oil?
How much above the minimum oil we see in the core is the actual amount, because that is what is variable, is the high case, low case. So we know there can't be less than what we measured, but we know there can be more.
So on that L15, if you remember that, where you use the log data to plot to establish your low and then the high, I presume there were mad log data that came with it.
Yes, and Mr. Rankin covered.
Yes.
Yes.
Were there gas shows or fluorescence, in most of the mad logs that you reviewed?
In the ROZ and the upper St. Andreas, there certainly was. In the lower St. Andreas, there were minor gas shows that admittedly could have been recycled gas.
Okay. So let me ask you this one more time. In your experience, have you seen any play where the estimated oil saturation is above 50%? And even in some places you have 60%, and oil is still immobile.
We usually have pay cutoffs that are higher than that, but yes.
So is your testimony that...
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Okay, so is your testimony that there are wells where the saturation is about 60%, but they still do not, it's still not mobile?
Yes.
Do you have a reference to some of these?
If you look into some more of the unconventional plays where there is a lot of tighter porosity, around 4%, if you get into tight sands that have oil, a lot of times I've been, Peregrino in Brazil, plastic sand, heavier oil, similar to what we would see here, but is definitely immobile at 60%.
Okay, so I asked this question wrongly. So I'm talking about a conventional play, not unconventional, where let's say saturation can go about 60%, and it's still the oil has not reached the critical oil saturation to move.
If we're looking at roll permit, we look at the core data that was given to us from the 679 or from the Arabelle. One of them shows that there are high saturations of about 60% in the lower porosity rock. Do we usually see that in conventional zones? We're not usually looking for that because the zones we're looking for are usually higher porosity than 4%. So it does happen, but usually I'd say the migration pathway, it's going to go mostly into the porous rock.
Do you know the type of, and in your previous answer, you talked about different types of oil that could probably result in that.
Yes.
But do you know the type of oil we are dealing with here?
I know that it's residual and probably a low API oil. I do not know exactly what it is.
Yeah, my next one was, do you know the API?
Nope. No, sir, I don't.
So this is a carbonate.
Yes, sir.
Right. So would you agree that probably started with, like, let's say, oil wet reservoir?
I would say assuming it's a water mixed wettability to an oil wet reservoir is a very easy assumption to make.
And then there's a high possibility that it can transition to, let's say, mixed wet with all the flashing that is going on.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm just saying that there's a range towards mixed wet to oil wet. It's a range of data. So it's a range of possibilities between the two.
So is your testimony that the rock that we're dealing with, the system that we're dealing with is probably mixed wet?
No, sir. I'm saying it's somewhere between mixed wet and oil wet.
Okay. Okay. Certainly you have a lot of experience. So help me here. Let's go to EMSU 679. So probably exhibit L25. If we can share that. L25. We have to turn it up. Yeah. Yes, 679. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, if you can turn it up. Yeah, and let's scroll down to the San Andreas bottom. Yeah. Okay, right there. So on track 7, the core data points, will this be the transformed? Would it be the corrected?
Those are the uncorrected.
This is uncorrected.
I would have to see the header, but I believe those are the uncorrected.
Well, I thought all from there onwards is all the analysis, the final analysis that you did.
Well, I still often show the raw data and the not. So that is just the S oil. That would be the uncorrected.
Okay, so which one is the corrected one? Because I don't want to.
The corrected one is not on there.
The corrected one is not here?
No, that is not on this plot.
Yeah, so then can we go back to that one? I think, yeah, we showed that earlier on.
Yes, in the plot that I just showed a few minutes ago, that was the
Yes.
679. If we can go back to that. Put to the PowerPoint, please.
And we will still come back to one more here, so.
Sure. This is it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. And thanks for clarifying that, because I was going to use the uncorrected one. Yeah, but so if you look at track number 10,
Mhm.
so then let's start with 9. So what were the M and N values that got you to 9, if you can share with us?
That they were variable. So the M varied between 2.3 and I believe around 4 or so. The N would have varied from around 3 to upwards of 9 based upon the porosity.
You said the M will vary from
2.3.
the M will be 2.3.
And it uses the Falk-Munn equation for it based on its permeability range. So I think it goes up to around the high 3s, low 4s.
Okay, 2 4s. And then the N?
The N was an algorithm I developed based upon the core calibration, which is from goes from a little bit over 3, I believe, to around not between 9 and 10.
Well, So you said you have a reference where the end value can go to 9 or even probably 20?
There's references that show that going over to over 20. I'm not saying it does that here. I'm just saying that there's references in the world. There's rocks in the world that do that.
Well, in my formation evaluation class, I guess probably I thought that the end value should be probably 1.8 to like 2.3, 2.5. And commonly, probably 2.3 is what people have been using a lot.
Then we'd have to add a lot more oil to this. Would be the result. If we used an N of about 2.3, we would end up with a booming reservoir that's 90% oil saturated. So we have to raise the N, as is suggested by literature, and mixed oil wet systems in order to pull the saturation down to the residual levels.
So that shows that without more or less measuring the M and N, I mean, let's say if you use more like the common numbers that we are more or less accustomed to, then that makes it much easier because I do know that, okay, these are the typical values that are being used. But going extremely high, it's just established the uncertainty associated with, let's say, these numbers without any proof, like you were talking to the chair about, any proof with regards to what is the actual N and then the M value.
Well, the M value did use something from literature, a variable, and did use the 2.3 from literature from the 4-county study used in the San Andreas. So I actually decided to make it a little more conservative and vary the M as in Mary, above 2.3.
Okay. So let's look at the track 10. Track 10. Starting from the bottom of the Greenberg, the bottom. So let's say where you have is it 39? Oh no, 40, probably just on top of the 4100.
Yes, sir.
And then so we probably 4050 where we have the core.
Yes.
Yeah. Right there, I think on your 10, I can see that there's a lot of improvement in the match, but certainly it's not 100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I can see that there's a lot of improvement there. Now, so right on the top there, we do have, how would you classify that? Is it a water zone? Right on the top, like let's say probably 4050 all the way to, let's say, 4100.
Well, I would suggest that is likely to be cores that have been had more fluid expelled through them. I would also suggest that Goodnight agrees with me because they're getting the same saturation that I am.
So then probably the 4050 maybe will be a water zone.
4050 would be, all of these would be mostly water. They would flow water.
Okay.
So would it be 100% water? No, but not based on the resistivity and the porosity and the calculations from both companies.
Okay. And once we go down, I'm just looking at the resistivity log and then also comparing to, let's say, the water saturations that we are seeing.
Yeah, totally copacetic. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to 4200 all the way to, let's say, 42. The distance between them is 2020, or I think it's 2020, right? Each box going down is 20. Okay.
Each one is 20. Yes.
Yeah, each one is 20. Okay. So then let's look at 4200 all the way to, let's say, 400 and 4280. So 4200 to 4280.
Yes.
On your track number 10, this one will be, how would you describe this formation?
I would describe this as a residual zone as well as Goodnight does.
And that is clearly shown also,
By
let's say, on the core.
Yes.
That is clearly shown. Now, my tough question to you is, how much of this will be recoverable?
I am not, given that we're going to do that, there's a plan for a CO2 flood. I am not, that's a question for someone else that is their specialty.
So as part of this hearing, are we going to hear from another testimony to tell us with all the numbers that has been estimated, how much of it is going to be movable?
Yes, sir. We're very aware. We've made note of your question over the past. We're very aware of the question. We will make sure it gets answered.
Okay. And I'm also, so I do see that there is a strong simulation that is coming up, right? So there are relative terms that were utilized in that. And I hope that also will more or less match up to, let's say, whichever oil that could be moved. So the simulation guru is in town, so probably
so
we'll get to
Doctor,
that.
Doctor, I would say that we have not had the opportunity to. We don't have relative perm data from here.
Yeah,
So,
but there was a history matching.
yes, and that will be spoken to at length.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so definitely I want to see the relative perm that was used for the history matching. So that's
Absolutely. I'm just clarifying. I apologize.
okay. Okay, I appreciate that. It sounds like you included mineralogy in your porosity and all the calculations.
Yes.
Okay. Let me skip all the M. Now, let me ask, so with the M and the N values that you used here, especially I think the M value is more or less typical, the one that you used, but the N, you said, has a broader range. Did you check with, let's say, the other fields in that area? You know, did you check with other fields in that area to see if there could be any analogous numbers that might have been used and established in the area?
I do have colleagues that have worked at San Andreas and other areas that have used variable N's that are similar, that can get pretty high. I'm not sure the exact statement, but the fact that a variable M and N is needed is a well-known factor.
Okay. Can we go to L22? There you are showing the core. You are showing the KV. So I want to know if this one is based on a core or is based on some type of calculation. L22. All right, there. Yeah, so on the left, or let's say on the right, will this be a core or is
That should be, sorry, I'm predicting your answer. I'm predicting your question.
no, I already asked, so
Okay.
you can probably proceed. Thank you.
So it is a core, it is a measured core.
And the measured core measured the KV.
Yes, sir. Those are individual measurements of, I believe, like full diameter samples.
You know, how is these, and it's great that they measured the KV.
Mhm.
I mean,
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
yeah. So how would this compare to the typical one where when we are doing simulation, we start with like, let's say, 0.1 of the KH?
So I know for reservoir modeling, they often use 0.1 in a lot of reservoirs, including clastics. And I always have a little bit of a hinky feel, a little bit of a weird feeling about it. So I think in this case, I would definitely make it something better than 0.1 for the KV, especially
Okay.
for the KV KH ratio.
Okay. And let's just scroll to the L25 one more time. And it would be great if you can make a note that this one is uncorrected, because when I saw it, I'm like, these are all different. But thanks for explaining that. So if you can take notice of that here. But I just want to point to something quick. So the bottom of the Greenberg, I think there we all agree that is a water zone. Just to confirm that the bottom of the Greenback where you have, let's say, GB 26, that zone down there, we agree that probably is a water bearing zone.
All I can say as far as agreeing or disagreeing is that for looking at the log properties and comparing the rest of the data to this, it does not calculate as being a 100% water bearing zone.
I didn't cut the last part.
Sorry.
I didn't cut the last part of your response.
Oh, I'm sorry. I always speak too fast. Based on the log data we have and the limited core data we have showing that there is some oil saturation, there is some residual oil there. What it would flow under conventional means would be water. 100% water with no trace of oil.
Okay. Thank you. Now, so there is Seminole, there is Talcotton, Goldsmith in the area.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Do you know the San Andres that is a target zone there went through the same injection as we are seeing in the EMSU?
Went through the same history?
Yeah, of saltwater injection.
I am not certain of that. No, I am not aware.
Definitely Steve will probably know about that.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, so this well, EMSU 679, do you know the year it was drilled?
I don't recall. I did look at the dates before. I know several of them were in the 90s. I'm not exactly sure when this one was drilled.
Yeah, so definitely I do know that the core was collected in 1990. So probably that was when it was drilled.
Excellent.
Now, and then also the analysis was performed in 1990.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that is what I have here. Now, do you know when the EMSU RR Bell number 4 was drilled?
I believe that was longer ago. I believe that was an older well.
Older well. Okay.
I could be misspeaking, but that's what I seem to recall hearing.
Yeah. So you have a lot of experience. So help me here. Mm-hmm. Can you quantify the impact of the large volume of water that has already been injected into the San Andres on the present day saturation numbers that, that probably we might have?
Depending on the affinity of the water, the chemical affinity, what's in it, the salinity, all that, it could have some changes on it. It could have some change on the saturation in the negative direction. Obviously not in the positive direction. So yeah.
Well, so what that means is that, okay, let me ask. So would you believe that, let's say this well 679 drilled in 1990, and with the higher levels of the saturations that are being estimated today, that has been estimated based on the 1990 well information, probably the present day oil saturation is not the same as this?
Potentially.
But you are using that to estimate how much oil is in place. And you're asking the commission to make our decision based on that. So how do we quantify, help us based on your experience, how do we quantify the current, how do we even say that the current oil in place calculation that has been put across here is correct without taking into consideration the maximum volume of water that has been injected?
Well, I would add to that is going to be clearly addressed by Jim.
Okay.
With his model, and he will.
I would love that. Thank you. Okay. But did you, based on your analysis, I saw you done a lot of wells here. So did you check the newer wells? If there are, let's say, any newer wells, to check the saturation changes compared to the older wells, whether consistent or probably not consistent?
That is a phenomenal idea. It wasn't part of the scope at the time that I did it, but it would be a great thing to check because the same petroscope model should work either way, and we should see variations from one to the other. So we would see a difference. So the newer wells would reflect current day saturations.
And now I really want to see an example of that, because then that one can tell us, let's say the impact of the saltwater injection on the saturation. I know models can do that, but real evidence, I mean, if you have the log and it's showing these changes to establish that there's still high level of ROZs in there, that at least helps us a lot to quantify the impact of the saltwater injection. Do you know if any RST log has been logged on any of the older wells? RST, the saturation log?
Oh, it's like a pulse neutron sort of.
Yes.
I believe there was an EPT run on a log in the north, but I'm not sure. I'm not aware of one in the EMSU. I'd have to look back at my database to see if I have any. So,
okay.
I look at about 10 different projects a week.
So let's go through this. Is it possible that the potential changes in the wettability system, and you clarified that you're saying that it is between oil wet and what mixed wet?
Yes, I'm hedging my bets and saying it's somewhere in between.
I thought probably you said, okay, it was oil wet, and then probably now we are mixed wet. So then I could have posed that question, but anyways, let me still ask. Is it possible that potential changes in the wettability system may impede the available oil saturation that has been calculated now?
Changes in the wettability would potentially change the saturations that we see.
And can you explain to the commission how the changes in the wettability might impact the oil saturation changes?
Changing its affinity to hold to the pore, to hold to the side of the pore, and along with drops in pressure can make things move. So if you're changing the geometry of the fluid within the pore, then you can make it move out of the pore space into another.
So does that mean that with the high volume of water that has been injected, like the flushing, and if there has been some changes in the wettability, it is possible that some of these ROZs, probably some of these residual oil became mobile and therefore probably might have been moved?
Within the larger porosities is where that is most likely.
Okay. Okay. Now, due to the higher volume of the water injection that has gone into the San Andres, it is definitely possible that there has been elevation in the pressure. The reservoir pressure might have increased. So do you believe that this can reduce the capillary forces, thereby more or less reducing the residual oil in place?
Oh, that's going back a long way for capillary forces. I would expect more that dropping the pressure in a residual oil would be more likely to move the hydrocarbons.
Yeah, and I'm sure probably you know where I'm going with this. But so let me ask another one. Can you comment, on the fact that with this higher volumes of water that has already been injected into the San Andres, probably increase the viscous forces, overcoming the capillary forces, thereby probably still reducing the residual oil saturation?
It's possible in the lower porosities. I would say that most of this was probably bypassed by the larger porosities where the water probably was more likely to go.
So with all these phenomena that I've gone through with you, based on your experience, would you say that there is quite a number of uncertainty associated with the oil in place calculations that has been presented to the commission?
I would say there is very little uncertainty with the presence of oil, but there is uncertainty with the calculation of the oil in place, and that's why I wanted to provide a low and a high number for possibilities.
Okay. So the processes that we just discussed and we went through this, do you believe that, and I think if you are able to provide to the commission, like let's say some analysis on the timeline with regards to older wells and then newer wells to see how the saturations are changing, probably that will clear all the doubts with regards to.
I would love that. Yeah,
Okay.
if that would help,
Okay.
that would be
Okay.
excellent.
Okay. Don't you believe that there should have been a prompt response from the operator and whoever the operator was, probably when the 679 well was drilled, there should have been a prompt response to probably more or less try to seize any injection in the area, because right now you have all these high volume of water that probably due to all the fossils that we talked about probably might have reduced the residual oil saturation.
I liken this back to the shale gas revolution, where a lot of stuff back then, like if you look at you just source rock was something you drill through. You don't look at it. You see it. You see gas response. You're like, oh, I'm not going to produce that. 20 years down the road, it's the thing of the day. So I imagine, and this is pure supposition, that if someone was looking at it back then and seeing that versus something they had above them, then they probably would be not that interested at the time.
So then that would be on the economics.
That would be on the economics at the time.
Okay. And do you know if we are going to listen to some economics here?
I cannot speak to that. I do not know. I hope so. That's yeah.
Okay. Okay. Oh, sounds like let me check to make sure I do not have any questions, any additional questions for you. But I'm also interested in the in knowing whether the Goldsmith, Talcotton, Seminole had any extensive water injection into, let's say, the San Andreas prior to the commercialization of the ROZs. I really want to have some answers to that.
I believe Steve will probably be able to cover that, and if not, I will get the answer.
Okay. On the average, how would you say your interpretation is different from the one that New Tech, I hope I got the name right, did?
New Tech, yes, that is correct. From what I can, they have a proprietary software. I believe they use the Siemens equation for their saturation equation, which as I use Archie, they used a variable M and N where they use 4 different M's and N's according to Mr. Rankin. So mine was I'd like to say a bit more complex, looking for the ranges, but that doesn't mean we both didn't arrive at but they didn't arrive at an answer that was close to the range of values that I provided.
Okay. So my last question will be, I went through most of the logs that you interpreted. There are some of them, there are quite like a number of them that you probably see that it is all water, especially within the lower San Andreas. Was that a trend that you saw?
There tended to be more water in the lower St. Andreas than in the upper St. Andreas.
Yeah.
And that's where usually where I discovered my RW was within those.
Oh, within the lower San Andreas. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your time, and I do appreciate your knowledge. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Poma. So this brings us full circle to you, Ms. Hardy, for Ms. Shaheen, sorry, for redirect. Before we do that, just I'm keeping track of time here. I guess it would be appropriate, given the audience, that I say that the Lovington sands are running out of our hourglass today. Mr. Rosatos has a 4 p.m. hard stop. It's 3:30 right now. We need to get Mr. Burkhead done and out of here. So just bearing that in mind, Ms. Hardy, I'll turn it over to you for redirect. And bear that in mind, Mr. Rankin, when the inevitable recross comes in. I'm sorry, Ms. Shaheen, sorry.
If we have to, okay. Thank you, Mr. Harwood. Mr. Burkhead, going back to your low case and a high case, I know you've described to me the range of possibilities between the low place and the high case. I'm sorry, the low case and the high case.
Mhm.
Can you provide a similar explanation to the commission about how that works?
Sure, certainly. What it's meant to represent, and I think we've already mostly covered this, is that it's the beginnings of an uncertainty study. So I'm looking for the lowest possible it can be and what is a reasonable value for what the highest it can be. So these can be considered likely to be the P10, P90 cases. There's a 90% chance it's going to be at least this small. And there's a 10% chance it's going to be at least this big at the end. So we're looking for a range of values, looking at uncertainty. You doing Monte Carlo analysis of the N in value when we have more data would be obviously the next step to go through to figure out the distributions, the possible distributions of OIP.
And you also talked about with Mr. Rankin and I believe with Dr. Ampoma, at what water saturation you would expect oil to be mobile. Have you reviewed any fields that inform your opinion on this subject?
I have worked several, and I think we talked about this a little bit, where I've worked in fields where the oil wouldn't move until you got to a saturation of like 80, 90% or 60 to 70% when you have heavier oils. The point is that just all of these are very dependent on fluids and the lithology and the porosity. So there's a direct relationship between the porosity and and the capillary forces and how easily it'll move. So it's just I guess to restate how difficult it is to answer in one answer with one value when it's going to move, because it definitely varies based upon the facies, the properties, the fluid type, and the pore space.
There was some testimony earlier about why, or excuse me, some discussion earlier about why the saturations in the core do not add up to 1. Can you elaborate on that?
I can't. I think that was basically just meant to tie up a question from before. I had to deal with this all the time. When I first started as a petrophysicist, I was really confused when I just saw oil, water, and it didn't add up to 1. It's because we lose water, we lose oil as we go up the hole. We lose it to gas, we lose it to, and when we get up to the surface, gravity, water falls out, it dehydrates, all those things. The summation with the porosity, it never equals up to 1. If it does, it's shocking, and it's probably a pressure core. And even within, it's going to be sloshing around within the tube. So what they typically call it in a lot of reports is saturation of gas. And forever when I first started, I thought that was like hydrocarbon gas. Turns out it just means saturation of air. It's just whatever's not fluid. So that is the why it never equals up to 1.
There was also some testimony earlier about the San Andreas tops and the differences between our pick of the tops and Goodnight's pick of the tops. Are you aware of any literature that addresses the top of the San Andreas as it relates to the Lovington Sands?
Yes, I have. This goes back to the reference from Ryan Bailey from yesterday about the Loco Hills field. We did go back to who defined the top within that paper. Turns out it was Mr. Roy Foster, senior petroleum geologist of the New Mexico Bureau of Mines and Mineral Resources in 1976. So it seems in this case, the description of the top of the San Andreas being about 130 to 150 feet above the Lovington Sand was made by New Mexico Mines and Mineral Resources.
Yeah. I'm going to make an effort to share at this point.
Dr. Ampoma, again, it's the speed with which you speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
You're definitely going to hold the record, at least so far. I'm sure the court reporter will confirm this. Most words per hour.
Yes. The Micro Machines commercial, I watched it way too many times growing up. So I'll repeat more slowly. So the Loco Hills paper that Mr. Ryan Bailey discussed yesterday at length, discussing the top of the San Andreas, the top was actually defined written about by Mr. Roy Foster, senior petroleum geologist. the New Mexico Bureau of Mines and Mineral Resources in 1976.
And turning to page, I believe it's page 12 here.
Yeah, it's the bottom of 12 and the top of 13, please.
I'm sorry, bottom of 12, top of 13.
Yes, ma'am.
Here we go.
So I'll just read this slowly. I'm sorry, can you?
There we go.
The San Andres Formation, Leonardian and Guadalupian, is about 1,500 feet thick in this area. The upper part is,
Sorry, here we go.
dolomite with an interval of sandstone and black shale known as a Lovington sand, about 150 feet below the top.
And the top there refers to the top of the San Andres.
Yes,
Is that
ma'am.
correct? Thank you. I would move for admission of this exhibit as K. K57.
Mr. Rankin, any objection?
Okay, and I'm going to turn now to figure 5 in the paper.
No objection from Goodnight.
Any objection from OCD?
No objection from OCD, Mr. Hearing Officer.
No objection from Rice Permian.
Pilot?
No objection from Pilot.
It'll be admitted. Thank you.
Excuse me, we already have a K57. I think she would be up to K60.
K60, I will trust you on that. Thank you very much.
It'll be admitted as Exhibit K60.
And turning now to figure 5 and exhibit K60.
This is simply an exhibit of what is described in words on page 12 and 13, the San Andres Formation below the Premier Sand and about 150 feet above the Lovington Sand. And again, defined by someone working for the state.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing here and share with you a different document. Let's see. This is, I believe, the mud log that Mr. Rankin used earlier, which is identified as Bates number. Empire 23614-17. I want to say 3917, but I'm not sure here. It's the exhibit that was previously admitted with respect to the excerpt that Mr. Rankin showed earlier. And I brought it up here to show it's the same document, a little farther up in the depths here. And I just wanted to have Mr. Burkhead take a look here. If we start, I believe Mr. Rankin was focused on maybe 4,200, 4,300, thereabouts. But if you look above and below the excerpt that Mr. Rankin used, you could see that there are other comments, observations about the cores that are different from what Mr. Rankin was focused on. And I thought it might be helpful to start here at about 4,050.
I'll object. That's way outside the scope of my cross-examination, I was focused on a very narrow area. This is almost 800 feet above where we're talking about.
Well, all right, but I think it's fair. You opened the door, and but I haven't heard a question yet. I'm hearing testimony from Ms. Sheen.
Thank you. I have a question now for Mr. Burkhead. If he could just take a look and he can direct me to what he thinks are the pertinent depths here as well. Taking a look here at the depth of 4,050, there are some observations of the core here that I think are helpful. Mr. Burkhead, can you describe those to the commission?
I absolutely can. So this is one of those places where up and within the upper San Andreas, we're seeing consistent descriptions of yellow fluorescence and streaming cut. And again, some lower gas along with the streaming cut, and also some higher gas along with the streaming cut and the fluorescence. So we're actually seeing, as I mentioned from the very start of whenever I started, that we have direct indications of hydrocarbons showing up throughout the San Andreas.
Are there any other depths that you would like for us to look at here?
I would probably look in the next 100 feet up to make sure that we're covering the bottom of the Grayberg and the top San Andreas. And to also see that we still have very large gas shows as we're getting into what I believe is the Grayberg.
Is this good? 3,900?
That would be perfect.
Would you please describe what you see here to the commission?
With this, it's not a complete, they ran out of words apparently on this, but this is a sandy dolomite with a very large gas response and moderately calcareous. There is no cut in these, but you can see that there's not always cut when there are massive gas shows. So you can have one or the other or none at all, but it all tells a story, all the logs together.
Any other depths that would be helpful for the commission to take a look at?
I think that would be plenty for now. I can't think of any at the moment. That would be.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhead.
Sure.
I have no further questions and pass the witness. And just would note for the record that we will be submitting the remainder of the mud log as an exhibit.
Okay, and I don't think there's anyone to pass the witness to. We're still gonna hopefully hold to the rule against a recross examination. Do you have any?
Mr. Hearing Officer, there was one segment of Ms. Shaheen's redirect that addressed mobile oil saturation that I would like to just ask Mr. Burkhead about.
Okay. Well,
Mr. Burkhead, on the question of mobile oil saturation, if 380 million barrels of water were withdrawn from the San Andreas in this zone that we've been discussing here with these oil saturations you've identified, would you expect that would be a reservoir character change that would likely lead to the mobilization of those oil saturations that you've identified?
If it's residual oil without significant chemistry change, it would be difficult to say how much would happen. If you significantly change the chemistry of the water, which it's being extracted, so it's the same, I would expect that only minimal considering it's residual, and anything above that would just be a tiny bit of the re-added oil that Bob Lindsay talked about the first day. That came out after nature's water flood.
I'm not sure I quite followed that. You're saying what would be?
Essentially what I'm saying is that there may be a little bit of oil extracted that could result in a sheen of oil on something that if someone looks for it, but that I do not expect a large amount of the oil to move.
Thank you.
But I think Dr. Mpoma's question was really good about checking them out versus time.
Thank you, Mr. Officer.
okay, may Mr. Burkhead be excused?
No further. Yes, he may.
No objection from OCD.
Yeah, he may be excused.
Pilot?
No objection from pilot.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhead. You're
you.
free to go.
And to the court
Appreciate
reporter, I apologize.
You kept her on her toes, Mr. Burkhead. If you ever get tired of your field, you have a great future as an auctioneer. All right, let's see. So it's 3:45. I mean, I don't know what we do with the spare 16 minutes. I suppose we could at least get Dr. Buckwalter sworn in, but I'm not sure it's worth it. Your thoughts, Mr. Rosato?
I don't think it's worth it either, but I do see that Mr. Rankin is raising his hand very with a lot of tediousness.
Sorry.
That's our attention.
I appreciate the attention. Mr. Hearing Officer, I appreciate that we're on limited time. I wanted to just orally raise this motion with the commission at this time based on the testimony that was provided by both Mr. Bailey and Mr. Burkhead. As you all are aware, I had previously filed a motion to strike the rebuttal witnesses, Mr. Bailey and Mr. Burkhead, only with respect to certain testimony and analyses that they provided that are clearly not rebuttal testimony, should have been presented as part of the case in chief. And based on the testimony that they presented over the past 2 days, I think that's been established that what they have presented is very different from what was initially presented on direct from New Tech and Empire's own witness, Mr. McShane. The petrophysical analyses, the oil in place analyses are vastly different than what was presented initially. And based on that, 2 weeks before the hearing, we have been substantially prejudiced by our ability to try to review and analyze what has been presented. We still don't have some of the information that we would need to do so. So I would ask at this time to renew my motion to strike the portion of the testimony I identified in my initial motion, or in the alternative, to provide us the opportunity for short SIR rebuttal so that we can adequately review and respond to the new testimony that should have been presented on their case in chief.
I have a couple of concerns, and I don't mean to step on anybody's toes here. I'm sure Mr. Rubin has thoughts on this as well. First of all, I'm not sure how much of what you're objecting to was covered in direct examination, and if it was, why there was no objections raised at that time, and how much of it was covered in your cross-examination of these witnesses. Because if it's covered in your cross-examination of these witnesses, you open the door to this testimony. When you cross-examine witnesses in a way that is like doing a deposition, you often end up with answers you don't like. Mr. Rubin, I'll pass it on to you. Those are just my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Harwood. And I do echo those sentiments. We should hear from Empire in response to the motion, especially now that it's been renewed, and we have, it is hard to parse out some of the testimony that would be struck versus that which would not be struck as well. That's a difficult challenge. But I suggest to the commission that we hear from the remaining parties on this point first.
First, I'll note that I believe Mr. Rankin has waived his objection here by allowing both Mr. Bailey and Mr. Burkhead to testify today without objection. Second, I would say, for all the reasons stated in our responses to the motion to strike and the motion to exclude, this testimony should be allowed. It's very clear when you review the written rebuttal testimony that the testimony is directly responsive to, in Mr. Bailey's case, to Preston McGuire, who has not yet testified, and to Dr. Davidson, who has not yet testified. It's very clear that this is in rebuttal to their testimony. Second of all, here we are on the third day, the end of the third day, and we have, I think, offered 3 witnesses, and it's very clear that Goodnight is going to have even more time to respond to the testimony of Mr. Bailey and Mr. Burkhead between now and the time that they offer their witnesses. And we don't, obviously, we don't believe there's a need for written rebuttal. But they're welcome to rebut the testimony that you've heard today and yesterday when they are back here with their witnesses. Generally speaking, in an administrative proceeding, the commission would act as if they were a court in a bench trial, and their expertise and their experience allows them to weigh the evidence and determine what is credible, what is reliable, and what should be included in their decision to support their decision. There's no need to exclude any evidence. And in fact, I'll just refer to one case, and it is an unpublished opinion, but I believe it's perfectly suitable or applicable here. It has to do with a case, a proceeding before the Water Quality Control Commission. And let me see if I can find it here relatively easily. And in that case, I'll describe it generally until I can find it. In that case, the Court of Appeals recognized that the hearing examiner did exactly what was appropriate in the instance. She allowed all of the expert testimony in, and then the commission weighed that testimony and decided what it should be relied on. And that case is cited in our papers. Finally, Goodnight is not prejudiced. They argue that they're prejudiced because they've had no opportunity to depose the rebuttal witnesses, supplement expert reports, or otherwise file a rebuttal. They cite a number of cases that are completely inopposite to what we're doing here today. One is a criminal case where the rebuttal witness was never disclosed. Another is a civil case where the rebuttal witness was never disclosed. So they've cited nothing in support of their position here today. We believe the motion should therefore be denied.
Mr. Moander.
So OCD is not picking a side on this issue, but to maybe flesh this out a bit more, I think it's an inaccurate statement to say that Goodnight didn't actually preserve the objection. They filed a motion on this. So I think there's a level of complying with the ultimate order from the commission and not creating or putting objections on the record at that point in time. Again, OCD didn't pick a side, but a lot of this testimony certainly does seem to be post facto developments designed to rebut other witnesses, not necessarily OCDs. But I did want to clarify that the record, I think, does have a thoroughly documented objection that listed specifically provisions that were at issue that was filed before the hearing, and the commission did in fact rule on it. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I didn't think that's totally correct under the circumstances.
Mr. Beck.
I agree with Mr. Moander that when you have a motion that's been submitted and then it's ruled on and you comply with that, you're not waiving your objection to renewing it afterwards. I think that it's unfair to say that it's clear that both of these witnesses were rebuttal to Mr. McGuire. I think that Goodnight did a good job in its motion in fairly, and I would say charitably, characterizing what was actual rebuttal testimony to Mr. McGuire versus what was substantive evidence. I think one thing that was very clear was, understandably, Empire was put in a difficult position when it revised Mr. Dwellin's testimony about the reservoir characterization, only to have Mr. Dwellin at his deposition say that he did not adopt his revised testimony. I think that put Empire in a difficult position because now we've got 3 different reservoir characterizations from Empire. And I think that probably the way that they've revised their witness list says a lot about whether this is actually rebuttal testimony or whether they want to put it forth as their primary evidence when you have your 2 rebuttal witnesses going essentially first out of your 11 witnesses as opposed to in rebuttal. So I think that Mr. Rankin makes a good point and renewing his objection, given the timeliness of that late disclosure and the inability to prepare for it, and the inability to depose either of those witnesses and have them change or disclaim their testimony as he got with Mr. Dwellin. So I certainly think that, at least in this case, we can see prejudice. I think that at the very least, given the timing of what we've seen today, if the commission's, intent is to stand by its order, and I would assume that it is, I don't think it's unfair, given the timing of what we're seeing over likely the next couple months in this hearing, to allow Sir rebuttal, which would rebut what has been classified, I think, by Empire as rebuttal.
Thank you, Mr. Peck. Mr. Suazo.
Yeah, Pilot concurs with Mr. Beck's statements just now and supports Goodnight's position on this issue.
Thank you. I guess my suggestion would be, since my 4 o'clock alarm just went off, that we think about this overnight and take it under advisement and rule on it when the commission thinks they've considered the issue as thoroughly as they need to. That would be my suggestion, and I'd turn it over to Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion as well. It is confusing to have rebuttal witnesses go first. That was a bit, and it is difficult to say when, if at all, Mr. Rankin should have objected at that point. I do think that I'd like to consider the case law, see if Ms. Shaheen's characterizations of it are correct. I think there's no reason why we need to rule on this 4 o'clock today. I will have a recommendation for the commission tomorrow.
I'm gonna before you I do have some leniency. I said 4 to 4:15. So I'm trying not to, please let's not make it 4:15, but if we have to, we have to. My question, can you reiterate, Mr. Rankin, what you want the commission through the objection, either sustain your objection or what?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner Rosado. I've asked for the commission to reconsider my motion to strike the portions of the rebuttal witness testimony that is not proper rebuttal. And I've identified that in the motion, and I've highlighted all the different exhibits and all the different testimony that is not truly rebuttal. In the alternative, I would ask that we be provided an opportunity, either through written sur rebuttal or orally, to respond to that additional testimony.
Okay, and that's what I wanted to clarify. Yeah. So your sur rebuttal, you would want the potential of either written or oral.
Yeah, and I haven't actually conferred with the witnesses who would be doing that. I think they can do it orally. I just want to make sure that when I do so, and as I heard Ms. Shaheen say, that there's no need to exclude any evidence in this case where you're acting as both the fact finder and the final arbiter. But I haven't yet conferred with him, but I believe either of them. But I believe that they can do it orally.
Okay, I must concur with the counsel for the OCC that the commission should think about this and do its homework as well, and look into, as was brought up, an unpublished opinion, I believe you mentioned, Ms. Shaheen?
There are a number of cases that we cited in our papers. So one that I'm thinking of that's most similar to this situation is In Re Louisiana Energy Services. And Ms. Orth was the hearing examiner in that case. And the court does an excellent job of explaining what is appropriate in an administrative proceeding. And
one second before you add your comment, just to clarify, this was a WQCC hearing, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And I apologize for interrupting you. Please continue with your thought.
Well, I would note for the record that Goodnight has had over almost a year to rebut the original testimony that we filed in the first 4 cases back in September, October of 2023. Then they had 10 months to rebut our arguments in that testimony. Basically, they're getting yet a third bite at the apple if they are allowed to provide written rebuttal here. And I for one, personally, don't believe that's fair.
Okay, I appreciate your sentiments. Thank you. We're okay. Go ahead, Ms. Rankin.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Just to respond, I do believe I preserved my objection because I did state at each witness, Mr. Bailey and Mr. Burkhead, that I intended to question them to determine whether or not their testimony varied from the underlying case in chief. I intended to question them to determine how and to what extent their testimony was different than and therefore not proper not proper rebuttal testimony. And of course, the information and testimony they provided is of course responsive to the testimony information that Goodnight provided, because we each have the same burden to prove that there's no waste and no impairment of correlative rights. So of course it's responsive. The point is that that information and the context that was provided should have been done in the direct case. Instead, it was saved until 2 weeks before the hearing, and that is what's unfair. Goodnight Empire had the same amount of time to assess whether between the time they submitted it in August 2023 and later in August 2024, whether their petrophysics and geologic analysis was the proper one, was the correct one. And they stuck with it all that time, and they could have changed it, but they waited until 2 weeks before the hearing to do so.
Okay. And both sides have been noted. I think you both have preserved your sentiments. For the record, I have to go back to what Mr. Rubin said. Let us do our homework on our end as the commission. We'll get our information. Guess what we're starting with tomorrow morning. So brace yourselves for another little delay in the morning so we can go over this. So I think we have a path for the time being where we're going to be going. And then Mr. Harwood, if you're okay with it, I think we could call it now and we can pick up again in the morning.
That sounds great.
Excellent. You all have a good afternoon and a good evening.